Okay. Hi, so today I'm going to be talking about consensus. So this is going to be a very simple talk about consensus. So first, what is consensus? So consensus, broadly, is simply reaching a common decision between a group of participants. There's lots of types of consensus algorithms, and you'll see lots of papers that mention lots of things like leaderless, leader-driven, asynchronous, partially synchronous and synchronous, deterministic and probabilistic. So I'm going to cover these things to a certain extent in this presentation later on. But just to go over it really quickly now, leaderless means that we're trying to reach consensus without having a leader. Leader-driven means that there is a leader selected to produce a block. Asynchronous, partially synchronous, and synchronous are all timing assumptions that are made depending on the algorithm that we're referring to. And deterministic and probabilistic is to do with the guarantees that we're trying to provide in the paper or in the algorithm itself. So some algorithms want to provide an absolute proof of the guarantees that they provide, whilst others are happy to provide a probabilistic proof of the properties that they're trying to guarantee. So the first algorithm I'm going to talk about today is the simplest one I know of. It's called slush, and it's based on the simplest algorithm that is in the avalanche paper. And it's based on random sampling. Random sampling is essentially the ability to pick at random between your peers. So the idea is that every participant in a network or in a group of participants samples a certain number of other participants, which I've here called K, and further to this will always be called K. And essentially the way it works is if a sample of participants for a given color is greater than a certain threshold, so here I've said alpha times K, then the participant flips color. So I'll explain that in pictures in a moment to make this clearer. If a participant has no color and is sampled, then the participant assumes this color. So participants can start off in two different colors or undecided, essentially randomly. So in this algorithm that I'm going to present, we're going to start with the assumption that alpha is 0.5 and K is 2. And by that, what I mean is that K is the amount of people we're going to sample, and alpha is the threshold of those samples that will make us flip color. So hopefully this will become clearer when I explain further. So generally in consensus papers, they make a set of assumptions in order to be able to form a proof over the consensus algorithm. So in this particular algorithm, we're going to make two assumptions. We're going to assume that every participant that is in the network is random. And we're going to assume that every sample we take is unbiased. So no other participant can bias the samples that we take. So in order to show you how the algorithm works pictorially, I'm going to show you it as a bunch of squares. So each square represents a participant. And in this case, there's three possible states that these squares start in. The gray squares are undecided. So these randomly started as undecided participants. The red square is a participant that started off as red, and the blue square is a participant that started off as blue. So the idea here is to show you how these squares can all come to a common color, essentially, so that they can all come to a collective decision. This is how they start. This is the initial state. The next step, so this looks a little confusing, but it's actually quite simple. What happens here is we have this square samples this square here, which was gray before, and upon sampling him, this one becomes blue because that is part of the algorithm. And then he goes to sample the next square, and this square now is going to eventually turn blue as well. So these lines mean that it's eventually going to turn to that color. This square was sampled by the red square, so he is going to turn red, and this red square samples this one, which was gray, and this one, which was blue, so we don't reach the threshold, and so this one's going to stay red for this instant. So this is basically how the algorithm works, that you sample two nodes, so k, and if alpha times k of those nodes, or greater, are a color that differs from yours, then you flip to that color. If, however, you're undecided, then you will always flip to the color that you are queried with initially. So in the case of this square, which was gray, because he was queried by a blue one, he immediately will flip to blue. So this is how it works. And so what happens next is that, as we saw previously, this one turned blue, this one turned blue. And so these two red ones will sample at random and eventually sample two blues and become blue because there's more blues in the network. And similarly, this red one will do the same thing and will also turn blue, and we'll end up with all of the squares turning blue, and so we'll end up with a successful consensus algorithm. And basically, this consensus algorithm relies on metastability. So essentially, it relies on the random properties of the participants. So if the participants all start out blue, then they will converge very quickly to the unanimous decision that is blue. If they all start out red, then they will be red. But if half of them are red and half of them are blue, it will be random whether the end decision will be red or blue. And that's why it's a very simple consensus algorithm. So this is the actual code to, I mean, it's partly pseudocode, but also mix of pseudocode and real code for how you might implement this particular algorithm. So as we saw before, if a node is queried, so a node is queried with the sender's decision, and if our current decision is undecided, then our current decision becomes the decision of the sender. So if the sender's decision was blue, then, and we are undecided, then we become blue automatically. And if we have a decision, so we're not undecided, then we respond our own decision. That's what happens when we're queried. And the main process that every participant executes is this one, which is essentially attempting to reach consensus. So the function is called decide. What happens if we choose a specific color? So say we choose red, and we never sample any other nodes. Well, what happens is that we're essentially acting as a malicious actor. So in this case, we will always remain that color in the network. So we're assuming a role that doesn't play with what the network is doing. We're going against the algorithm. And so this idea of malicious processes is interesting because after a certain amount of malicious processes, we can actually control the outcome of this particular algorithm. So how many of these malicious processes does it take to control the outcome is another interesting question. The answer to that is will be shown in the next slide. So M is an interesting one because so in this particular slide we had for R equals 1 to M. So if M is finite and we have attackers in the algorithm, then we can show that safety cannot be guaranteed. So safety is essentially the notion that you must arrive at the same decision after a finite amount of steps or after a while in some certain cases. In this cases, it would be under a certain amount of steps. We can't guarantee safety if a process decides to stay red, because after M steps, there will be one red process and all the others will be blue. And so in that case, safety will be broken. If M is infinite, then we have a completely different problem, which is that the red process could influence other processes. And once it sees that half of the processes are its color, it could now flip to another color. So let's say I'm red, and I influence the processes around me to become red, and then I see that half the network is red. Now I'm going to flip to blue and influence them to go blue, and then when I see that half of them are blue, I flip to red, and they can do that infinitely. And essentially, that is a liveness issue, which means that essentially the network will be kept in constant flux. So that breaks liveness. So this algorithm, depending on how you modify M, can be broken either in safety or either in liveness. What I said previously was that a certain amount of attackers can basically destroy the consensus. So since the decisions are made based on alpha times k samples, so 0.5 times 2, so greater than or equal to 1 sample, it takes only that many processes to influence the decision or infinitely delay it in this particular algorithm. So in consensus parlance, we would say that this algorithm is tolerant to alpha times k Byzantine processes. So Byzantine processes you can think of as simply processes that do not adhere to the rules of the algorithm. They go against what they're supposed to do. And we can make the algorithm more resilient by adding conviction to the algorithm. And we can also add finality to this algorithm, which is essentially the notion that after a certain point, we are guaranteed that a certain decision will hold. So this is the fixed algorithm. And essentially, so the difference between this algorithm and the other one is that now we have a notion of conviction in red and a conviction in blue, right? And a specific count, which is going to give us how many of a specific color of our current decision are we convinced by. And so here, instead of having a loop from 1 to M, we simply say, whilst there is no finality, or in essence, whilst there isn't a decision that has been accepted finally, then we loop. So similar to before, if there's no decision, then we skip the loop. Otherwise, we sample the network processes, we query that sample in the same way we did before. So the main difference is in this section where so we have to look at the conviction. So if we have more of a process, if a process has more reds than blues, for example, then we increase the conviction in that particular decision. So we keep counters essentially of the red or the blue decisions. And if the conviction in one particular decision ends up being greater than another, then we flip to that decision. And we set the new decision to the last decision. And essentially the count here is in order to keep track of finality. So if we have a certain amount of conviction that has been counted that's greater than another parameter, so we call it beta, but essentially that's the finality parameter. then we accept the decision, finally, and that will give us our consensus. So now we have a consensus algorithm that's actually a lot more resilient than the prior one that I showed. And the reason why is because this one keeps track of state. So now we know that we have a certain amount of conviction in red, a certain amount of conviction in blue, and it's much harder for us. So after a certain point, because of the count, it's impossible to flip somebody. So for that reason, there isn't any longer this notion of being able to flip a color from red to blue and keep the network in flux. So for that reason, there isn't a liveness issue. And this algorithm is also safe because of the notion that there is state that is kept, and there is a point of no return, so there is finality. And it's guaranteed that eventually finality will be reached, even in the presence of malicious actors. So we fixed the previous attacks, but what's the problem with this algorithm? So the problem is that we assumed in the beginning that every participant in the network is random and that we have an unbiased view over the network. And this is doable, but it's actually quite difficult to implement in practice. And in practice, this algorithm actually only guarantees a partial order over the decisions that are made. So it's leaderless, everyone makes a decision, but when you make consecutive decisions, they do not preserve an order. So I would have a set of decisions that I've made, and you might have a set of decisions that you've made, but they would not be in the right order, even if they are consistent. And that's a big problem with this algorithm. So the next algorithm I want to talk about, which is slightly different than this one, is Tendermint. And for Tendermint to work, we have to make two completely different assumptions. We have to assume that every process is connected reliably, so no messages are dropped. And we have to assume that at some point in time, processes will become synchronized according to time. So that means that we have to have a clock. And in fact, in the previous algorithm, there is no time at all. So time is completely unnecessary. And actually, just a note about that is that essentially when you make no assumptions on time, then you say that that algorithm is an asynchronous consensus algorithm. When you start to make assumptions on time, then your algorithm either falls into the partially synchronous world or the synchronous world. Okay, so that's what I just said. So yeah, the only thing I didn't say is that if the algorithm requires lockstep synchronization, so if every process operates in lockstep bounded in time, so I start and another process and another participant starts, and we end every step at the same time in lockstep, then that is the synchronous setting. And partial synchrony is when we don't know exactly when we're going to become synchronized, but eventually we will become synchronized. So that's the difference between those two. So in the theory of consensus algorithms, it's been shown that in the presence of one Byzantine process or one malicious actor, it's not possible to create an asynchronous algorithm that is Byzantine fault tolerant for more than just one Byzantine actor. And this is a really important result. It's called the FLP result, impossibility result. And there is a way of circumventing this using randomization. So the algorithm we saw previously, although very simple, actually does circumvent this result and has a higher threshold of tolerance of Byzantines because it assumes that you can randomly sample. So it has randomization built into it. It's not a deterministic algorithm. Whether it will be able to terminate or not is probabilistic. So theoretically, you can only obtain n/3 Byzantine fault tolerance in asynchronous algorithms and partially synchronous algorithms. But in the synchronous setting, as in Bitcoin, for example, you can tolerate n/2. It's not just Bitcoin. Any algorithm that is synchronous essentially, so basically makes a very strong assumption on time, has been shown that it can have a higher threshold of Byzantines. Partial synchrony is interesting because it has two thresholds essentially. It's n/3 in the general case, so if the communication and processing is not synchronous, then you can get up to n/3, but in a very specific case of partial synchrony where communication is synchronous and Byzantines are authenticated, so in our case they would be via public keys and public key cryptography, then you can actually achieve n/2 Byzantines. So Tendermint, so I'm going to show the same participants approach for Tendermint. So in Tendermint, the main difference is that instead of thinking of things as having everybody's trying to take a decision, we think of things as we're going to select one of these people in the group of participants to be the person that needs to make the decision, and then we're going to vote on whether that person's decision was good or not. In a practical scenario, you would have one person selected to produce a block, and the others voting on whether that block is valid or not. So that's, for example, the way Bitcoin works, Tezos works, and many other different blockchain networks who select a block producer. So here we have the yellow square. That's the leader. He's selected to produce the next block. So every other participant has so this block's now proposed red. Every other participant looks at it. Is this a valid value that this person is proposing, or is this something that's not correct? And they'll vote for that. So they'll say, I endorse this, or I think that this is a correct value. And then the next step is to ask, do we have 2/3 votes for, so first step is they vote. The next step is to ask themselves, has everyone else voted? And do we have a sufficient threshold of those people who have voted to be sure that this block is in fact correct? So can we really accept this? And so they look, and if there's 2/3, then the block is accepted, and now the next leader of the participants is selected to produce the next value.
How they can decide if there are 2 out of 3?
So how can they decide if there's 2 out of 3? Yeah. So this is 2/3, right? Not 2 out of 3. Mm-hmm. So essentially, since the first step is that they vote, we assume that they can all communicate reliably the fact that they've voted. So every participant is expected to receive all of the votes of the other processes. In fact, that was one of the assumptions of this algorithm. And so at this point, when we are wondering about how many votes there are, we assume that we've received all of the votes by that point. And also, the other thing to note is, because this is in the partially synchronous setting, we're assuming that there's going to be a point of synchrony where everyone has all of those votes and that they can tally them up correctly, right? So it's harder to do that kind of thing in the asynchronous setting. So since processes decide based on 2/3 of participants, if 1/3 of processes are Byzantine, then they can prevent progress, right? So they can prevent a real vote from occurring. So why is that? Because if 1/3 goes offline and you need 2/3, then, well, let's say 1/3 plus 1 to make it, the actual number that they need is 2/3 plus 1, right? Hence why we say 2f plus 1. So it's just simpler to think of it as 2/3. So if 1/3 of the processes are malicious, then they can prevent progress for infinity because they can just decide not to vote. And so there can be no liveness in that scenario. And that's why we say that this algorithm is n over 3 Byzantine fault tolerant. To make two processes accept conflicting decisions, so to break safety in this case, it's a lot harder to do that, right? You would have to take 1/3 of Byzantine processes and partition the network into two parts, essentially. So the rest of the participants are partitioned into two, and you essentially give one set of votes to one part and one set of votes to another, and then you have 2f plus 1 in both groups, which can then lead to a conflict being accepted and break safety. So with 1/3 Byzantine processes and network partitioning, you can break safety in this case. But network partitioning is actually a little bit complicated to do. It implies that you have to somehow control the communication channel in some way. So due to these 2 points, it's said to be tolerant to n over 3 Byzantine processes. So what we've been doing at Nomadic Labs in the consensus group is to create Tendermint, which is essentially an amended version of Tendermint to work with basically to fit Tendermint and to modify it so that certain issues are fixed within it. Specifically, there are some details about the Tendermint algorithm where, due to the way that it handles partial synchrony, it's possible to, they have essentially a weight for the messages. So they wait on 2f plus 1 for the votes, which instead of doing that, what we do is timeout, because otherwise you can get into a situation where the network comes to a halt when it's trying to reach consensus. We are also investigating a way to get a better Byzantine threshold potentially from the Tendermint algorithm by potentially leveraging the synchronous assumption instead of being in the purely partially synchronous setting. Or maybe even trying to assume that communication is synchronous in some way, or making it synchronous in some way so that we can get n over 2 in the partially synchronous setting. So the conclusions we made about this when we did some analysis on the different types of consensus algorithms that there are is, so the gossip network in Tezos doesn't guarantee unbiased randomness or random sampling. It's quite difficult to ensure that, in fact. So we can't really satisfy the assumptions that the first algorithm demands. So even though it's a really pretty algorithm and it works in the asynchronous setting and it's nice, we don't, it would be more difficult in practice to actually map this onto Tezos. And the issue with partial order makes it tricky to resolve the ordering of the blocks in practice. One thing to say that I would like to say about this, though, is that it's possible to use this algorithm for the mempool. So that's one area where it could be applicable. And the implementation of Tezos already makes timing assumptions. So we already have every baker essentially synchronize according to time, check that a block is baked at the right time, etc. And because of this, it makes it quite simple for us to fit an algorithm that makes timing assumptions onto Tezos. So ones like Tendermint and other algorithms that depend on having a synchronized global time oracle. And the other thing is the mempool simulates a set of well-connected processes, so it's pretty reliable. We can expect that we will get messages that we want in the mempool when we're trying to reach consensus. And for that reason, we can also satisfy to a certain degree the assumptions made in the Tendermint paper. However, about this point, Tenderbake makes it so that the communication channel doesn't have to be quite so reliable as in Tendermint. And we did that because we don't want to stall the network waiting on messages to arrive in the case that a communication failure occurs. And that's it. So thank you very much. If you have any questions. Yeah.